Mage Storytime, Episode 26, Critical Mist. This is the continuing story of the Iron Goldfish, a party of role-players who awakened as mages. Our cast includes Alwi, who manipulates time with his phone; Bard, a mind and spirit mage who uses superheroes as his gods; Critical, who improves the luck of others through his own pain; Handy, a correspondence-using thief who steals items at long range; Kitty, who empowers his stickers and cats with spirits; Tello, a postmodern mage who uses a hodgepodge of skills to manipulate forces and matter; and Weeb, who uses his life skills to enhance his martial arts and Chinese medicine. With the holiday season upon us, it was several weeks before we could all manage to meet at the same time again for our regularly scheduled wizardry. But when the scheduled time finally arrived, we were a little distressed to still be missing one of our number, Critical. Well, we weren't too distressed. He was an independent sort, and would often wander off to do his own thing elsewhere, sometimes in the middle of a conversation. We didn't have time to concern ourselves with that, however, as a strange man chose that moment to enter the shop. He was tall and unshaven, with scraggly hair and a general unkempt appearance. We asked what he wanted, and he just stuttered, No time. Here, just take this." So saying, he tossed an envelope at Weeb and staggered out again. Weird. We took a look at the envelope, which was very ornate, and saw that it came from the Order of Hermes. Weeb handed the envelope to Handy, since that was his tradition. That way, if it was a bomb, it would take out their own man first. The rest of us hid behind our portable blast shield as the sucker opened the letter, but nothing exciting happened. It turned out to be an elaborate-looking scroll. Why someone would place a scroll in an envelope we didn't know, but the Hermetics did like their ostentation. Handy opened that and read it to us. "Dear Iron Goldfish, all hell is broken loose and the majority of our order has been sent out on a mission. We kindly request your assistance with a potentially world-ending phenomenon. Please come to the order ASAP. Bring everyone. Bring weapons. Bring lawyers, guns, and money. Bring everything. Oh God, help us all. Warmest, Katie." "Everything, you say?" queried Weeb, and darted into the back room and into the digital web space we had attached. A lot of banging and cursing started coming from him, but we did our best to ignore it. We held a quick council and unanimously decided to go. After all, it was a bad sign when all of the Hermetics, at least locally, had a collective freakout. And it was worse when all of them together didn't have the mystical muscle to sort something out on their own. This sounded like it could threaten the world, which was coincidentally where we lived, which made it our problem. About that time, we heard an enormous clanking coming from the back, and a towering suit of fully functional power armor strode out of the storeroom, a massive flamethrower mounted on the back of one arm and a humongous power claw on the other. When we stared in silence, a space marine Weeb just said, "She said bring everything." He had a point, although we would have to rent a flatbed truck to transport him there in this state. Less than an hour later, the flatbed pulled to a stop outside the Order of Hermes Chantry House, and we all disembarked. The rest of us came loaded for bear, just not to the same nerdy extreme as Weeb. That's why he got his name, after all. Well, that was more about anime, but he was a raving fanboy for lots of nerdy stuff. When we came in, we walked into the middle of chaos. Interns were running around in a blind panic, throwing papers hither and yon and creating a blizzard. In the whirling mass of documents, we saw Katie, our usually cheery contact from the Order of Hermes, hair out of place and shouting incoherent orders. When we walked up, she greeted us and said, simply, "For the last 3 days or so, we've been having zombie reports all over Dallas. We've been putting them down, but every time we do, they pop back up somewhere else. We don't know where they're coming from, and on top of all that, we can't find that old bastard Archimedes. We haven't seen him in about a week, but he may be in his dimension-jumping magnificent mansion. We think he's gone rogue, and maybe even fallen to Jor." "Fuck," was our only response. Well, the armored Weeb tried to run away, but he moved so slowly in the bulky stuff that we talked him back around before he got too far. You see, we had some idea that the multiverse was a real thing, and fiction was more like a different reality. We had gathered that in part from Bard's superheroes continually insisting that they were the dream selves of real, living beings in some other universe. So we had some idea that our former D&D campaign, wherein we had been evil adventurers taking on a worse monster in the Tomb of Annihilation, might be a bit less fictional than we would like. We also had the Cloaca Dentata egg, which was a self-inflicted curse from one of our characters in that game. The stone artifact actually seemed to transport its victims there from our reality. This was a problem because Archimedes, the mad old hermetic who had turned a vampire into a hernia cushion, bore a striking resemblance to Archimedes, the mad old necromancer who we had fallen in love with, started working for, and gifted several elder god corpses in our old campaign. And since Archimedes just happened to have a dimension-jumping mansion, there was now a non-zero chance that Archimedes the wizard was really Archimedes the necromancer, who we had helped construct an endless dimension of zombies and skeletons inside a bag of holding. If only we had known our actions would have consequences. Game responsibly, kids. And even if that wasn't the case, it was pretty bad when a wizard of Archimedes' power went rogue or fell into Jor, a mystical, destruction and death-focused madness. Despite our qualms, this was the only world we had to live on, though a spirited debate was had about finding new ones. So we had to protect it. Katie gave us a small crystal with a chunk of wood tied to it. She told us it was a piece of Archimedes' mansion, and that when we got close it would start to vibrate. Around this time, all we happened to recall that things had been a bit odd at the garden where he worked. The lake on which the garden sat had been incredibly foggy for the last 3 days or so, which was odd since it had been bright and sunny all week. We decided that would be a good place to start. Before we got too far in our hunt, we figured it would be worthwhile to check on Critical. I mean, he was the DM for the campaign where we had first maybe met Archimedes, so there might be some metaphysical weirdness going on. Unfortunately, his roommate said he hadn't been home in about 3 weeks and was starting to get worried, although he had been sure to feed Critical's dogs, which was something. He hadn't been seen at work or by his mother in the past 3 weeks either, which was disconcerting. But Critical had been gone for 3 weeks, Archimedes only 1, and the lake had only been weird for 3 days, so it could all be coincidence. So we really didn't have any leads to go on, and the zombie problem seemed a little more pressing. Also, just to be safe, we called the Technocracy and left one of the Kevins a message to maybe have the military and a bunch of nukes on standby. No, not for any particular reason. Just seemed like that kind of day, you know? We arrived at the lake and spread out to check the various sections of it, using a group voice chat to stay in touch. Always stayed with Weeb and kept taking pictures of him, making the practical armor look like some sort of cosplay photo shoot. Fortunately, the fog clearly billowing out of the lake didn't affect our phones or internet, so we were able to communicate without problems. But when Bard checked with Coyote, he was informed that there was something weird about the center of the lake. There seemed to be an almost perfect sphere in which nothing magical was occurring, not even normal nature background stuff. For her part, Taylor regularly kayaked on the lake, so she drove home and got her boat and set out from one of the launches, carrying the sensing device from the Order. As she got closer to the center of the lake, she felt the crystal vibrate and started to use it as a hot-cold detector. As she paddled, she carried a long length of chain, with Weeb holding on to the other end. As she got closer, Bard stood on a bridge on the north side of the lake that extended over the water and used his spirit vision to try and figure something out. Everything looked normal, except for the gouts of flame bursting up from the center of the lake, very close to where Tello was headed. Tello couldn't see any of this, however. The frog in front of her was like something out of a cheap horror movie, so she mostly floated along, paddling every now and then to alter her direction to match the crystal's buzzing. It felt like an eternity to her, but it was really only a few minutes before she was totally lost. Finally, in desperation, she summoned the spirit of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, who guided her straight to the shores of a little island resting in the center of the lake, which was a new feature. Before her the fog lifted and she saw mangled, blackened trees, beyond which there was a still smoldering fire. "Ah, crap," she said, reaching back to give the chain a tug. As she used matter to transmogrify it into an extremely sturdy ladder, Weeb started marching into the lake. Protected by his sealed power armor, he walked across the bottom of the lake until the chain rope went vertical and joined into a heavy ladder. Above him floated both a kayak and a small island, both completely unmoored and drifting slowly. Everything was going fine until the Kraken came around the corner, grabbing him around the waist and pulling him into a crushing grip. He sent a message to Bard saying, "Fighting a Kraken, BRB," and leapt into the fray. He stabbed out with his crushing power claw, ripping a chunk out of a tentacle, but the beast repeatedly smashed him into the rock floor of the lake. His power armor was sturdy, and the rock was only limestone, but Weeb started to get motion sick inside. At last he was able to turn and bring his flamer to bear, firing streams of burning promethium into the monster's rubbery hide. It didn't do a lot of visible damage to the creature, but it made the beast flinch, and apparently caused it enough pain to drive it off. Weeb turned back to the ladder, merrily humming to himself. He pulled himself to the surface where he met Tello and Handy, who had teleported over in an attempt to get a good look at a live kraken. He was sorely disappointed and tried to kick Weeb in the ankle, only succeeding in hurting his foot. About the same time, several of us who had prime sight, which was almost everyone, saw a strange bridge extending from one point on the east side of the lake out into the center. Those of us who lived in the area confirmed that it was new. Also invisible to normal sight, so it was probably magic of some sort. As Bard, Kitty, and Always started up the bridge, they noticed that it seemed to stop abruptly in midair. Then they saw the zombies. The party on the island also saw the zombies. Then they saw more. They had moved towards the base of the bridge, where the burned woods turned into a burned mansion. A group was headed toward the other party members, and a similarly sized horde. What do you call a group of zombies? A dunce? A hunger? A maga? Was coming up from the woods. Handy pulled a bowling ball out of his bag and sent it hurtling at them, hitting several in the shins and knocking them over. Then Tello pulled her flaming sword and Weeb unloaded with his flamer, and the zombies were reduced to a mass of ash. Back on the bridge, Bard muttered, "These undead are making me angry. They wouldn't like me when I'm angry. Bard, smash!" and called one of his more violent gods into himself. He bulked up and turned greenish in hue, then charged at the oncoming monsters with a bellow. As he ran, he heard an ominous creak and one of the boards gave way beneath him, causing him to faceplant directly in front of the oncoming creatures. The concussion did cause them to take a step back, but that was it. "Bard feels silly," he muttered. "Bard's sad." Kitty ran up and gave him a reassuring pat, which also contained the sticker that normally turned him into a roided-out rage monster. So he basically made the Hulk out. The result was not pretty, and unfortunately for the rest of the party, they were in the splash zone, which, considering Weeb, Tello, and Handy were a good 50 yards away, was damned impressive. At least it was over quickly, though, and Bard stood there drooling and snarling quietly to himself while the rest of the party coordinated. As they took stock, they saw what looked to be a rock outcropping, except that it was man-made, peeking out of the ruin. Walking over, they saw some sort of room or basement that had been unearthed. As we watched, a zombie ran up the stairs, saw us, turned on its rotted heel, and dashed back down the stairs, evidently in a hurry to get somewhere. We followed it, of course. As we trooped down into the cellar, we got a final glimpse of the running zombie as he was grabbed by a huge monster and swallowed whole. The gigantic, bloated creature seemed to be nothing more than an enormous pile of meat with a face and gut. It roared at us. Bard and Weeb roared back and charged. They rained blows on the creature, but all it seemed to accomplish was to make the voluminous folds of blubber jiggle excitedly. After a few solid seconds of this, Handy decided the outside was impervious, so he pulled a grenade out of his bag, then opened a small portal in the bag into the creature's gut and left the grenade as a parting gift. The explosion rocked the room, but the bloated thing's rubbery hide contained the blast, so we weren't too bothered. As we were surveying our work and poking the disgusting thing to make sure it was dead, we noticed its bulk was blocking an elevator shaft. Fortunately, Weeb and Bard had their big boy forms on, so they were plenty strong enough to shift the piles of blubber and viscera. They complained about it, but they did it. Around that point, deciding that the rage monster form was too bulky for him to hit well, and that it made it hard to think, Bard pulled Kitty's sticker off and dropped his superhero spirit. Then he summoned his regular guardian totem with a cry of, "Wisdom of Solomon!" This connection was stronger and would make it easier to fight. Plus it was less bulky, so there was more room on the elevator. Not that room was lacking. It was apparently a freight elevator, and we had plenty of space to spread out. As we rode the elevator down, a thought occurred to Handy. From Weeb's description, the island was floating free in the middle of the lake. So how was there an elevator going down as far as we had in the last few minutes? We quickly realized we were somewhere that wasn't the real world. We were used to this, so it wasn't really a problem, but it was nice to have confirmation. As we were discussing this fact, several humanoid-shaped monsters dropped down on our platform from the darkness above. Weeb, Bard, and Alwee immediately lashed out with their fists, which were having much more effect than they had had on the bloated creature in the previous room. This time, heads were splattered and knocked off shoulders with ease. Still, they kept coming, and after a minute or two, it looked like we would be overwhelmed. Fortunately, they were mostly appearing at the edges of the platform, rather than falling directly on our heads, so there was some room to create hostile terrain. Weeb laid down a burning blast from his flamer, which blazed merrily and lit any creatures unfortunate enough to land there. On the other side, Handy pulled a sack of marbles from his bag and scattered them around the floor. making it hard for the monsters to keep their footing. Then Tello transmogrified the glass orbs into sturdy glass caltrops, making the footing even worse. Between these two defensive fields and our big guys bashing skulls, we managed to keep the creatures at bay until the elevator dinged to a stop and we piled off, eager to get out of the enclosed space. Bard forced the door closed and Tello welded it together magically. We took in our surroundings and found ourselves in a long hallway leading to a black door. There was a file of the creatures that had jumped on us, hence our naming them jumpers, shuffling slowly towards the door. As we watched, massive spikes thrust up from the floor in measured intervals, coincidentally impaling all of the jumpers but the foremost. We watched as the spikes retracted and they fell to the floor. Now we were left with the problem of how to get across the room. Tello used matter to change the chemical composition on the outer layer of her gloves and shoes to a potent adhesive, and Spider climbed across the hall on the ceiling. For his part, Bard used his superpowered muscles to leap over the spikes, nearly bumping into the climbing Tello at the peak of his jump. He landed between the spikes and kept jumping, leapfrogging between the spike traps and their telltale corpses, making it with no difficulty. Always slowed time and dashed across before the traps had the opportunity to trigger. Then Handy called us all stupid and simply opened a hole in the wall that led out at the other end of the hallway and stepped through, completely circumventing the traps. Now that's thinking with portals. We turned to face the door. As we approached it, the face of Archimedes protruded from it. We greeted it in a friendly manner, and all we asked that it please not kill us. "Greetings, interlopers! This is a recorded message. You are trespassing on my property. Please fuck off." "But we brought you pizza," offered Weeb, creating a steaming pie out of pure magic with an effort of will. "And some pot," offered Bard, pulling some out of his pocket. It wasn't magic, he just typically had some on him. "Recorded response. Passwords weed and pizza recognized. Enter, friends." And with that, the door swung open. Stepping inside, we were greeted with a strange sight, which was saying something in this place. The room was caked in blood. Within, we saw numbers of zombie corpses, intermingled with a number of bodies that looked exactly like a younger version of Archimedes. Weeb suggested that he was going for immortality via cloning, but Barb countered that he could be hunting and killing his alternate universe selves for power, like that one Jet Li movie. You know the one. We walked in and started to investigate the bodies when we heard a whirring noise from above. Looking up, we saw 4 gigantic, fetus-looking things covered in viscera suspended from the high ceiling. Also, there was a floating chainsaw flitting about in empty space. That was weird. Weeb saw the chainsaw and his heart filled with lust. He leapt into the air and made a grab for it, but it zoomed out of his way. This kept up for a little while as he cooed to the weapon, until finally he coaxed it close enough with promises of turning it into a chain sword and doing all sorts of violence with it, and he was able to grab it. On the butt, in invisible magical ink, he read, "Property of Archimedes, Singing Chainsaw." He asked it its name, and it told him Sandy. He fell in love. While that was going on, Bard scanned the fetus things with his mind powers and declared them to be puppets of some other influence. He declared it karmic retribution for the meat baby, but the rest of us weren't so sure. We started to agree when the things dropped to our level and started to menace us. Not that they actually did anything, but they were big and freaky looking, which counts as menacing in our book. Bard was going to punch one, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. But a few friendly jeers and insults bolstered his courage, and he got over it. Always showed him how with his newfound combat training. With that, we all laid on in our various ways, and the fetuses were quickly turned into chunky salsa before they could do anything but spit a few ineffectual gobs of acid in our general direction. It was also during this time that Weeb started reciting impromptu love poetry to his new chainsword, but we ignored that. We were so busy dealing with the horrible gore babies that we didn't notice the door on the far side of the room opening. Luckily, nothing came through to eat us, so we were able to finish our business without interruption. Before we entered the next room, though, Kitty placed one of his stickers on Sandy the chainsword. Normally, his stickers wouldn't work on an inanimate object, but Sandy was sentient, so the effect took hold and Sandy became a Zweihander chainsword. Weeb giggled uncontrollably. We walked through the doors and into an open field. In the middle distance was a large manor, the sky behind it cloudy and tumultuous, with the occasional meteor streaking through it. Again, we saw signs of the battle between zombies and Archimedes clones. Occasionally white, wispy ghosts coalesced into the form of Archimedes, but as soon as they saw the pizza and joint, which were being held out as tokens, they parted in front of us. The scene at the manor was carnage. There were dozens of Archimedes corpses and scores of zombies littering the ground. A little ways away, we saw 3 of the jumpers face down the last of the Archimedeses. He blasted 2 of them with a fireball, but the third skewered the young mage with a spear and stood triumphantly over the corpse. Handy fired off an arrow that took him between the eyes, and we moved on cautiously. We still weren't really sure who to side with. Zombies were bad, after all, but we couldn't put it past our friendly Archimedes to control an army of the undead to fight an alternative self for ourselves. But we could also see him making a clone army to fight a bunch of zombies. It was really too close to tell. The grand hallway, when we entered the manor, was completely trashed. Wallpaper torn down, furniture smashed, holes in the walls, floor, and ceiling, and so on. 3 doors stood before us. Tello checked around with her spirit sight and noticed that there were 3 souls above us, but that the bodies around us, and the few live clones/zombies she could see in the distance, all lacked any sort of spirit. We knew we wanted to go up, but that didn't tell us which door to pick. They had markings on them, but all were too damaged by time and conflict to be legible. So all we reached out and de-aged them, reverting the doors back to a time when they could easily be read. One read Janitor, one read Men's, and the final read Lab. We decided the lab was the best option. As we stepped through the door, we were met by the sounds of bubbling and churning, along with crashing and the rifling of papers. We saw at the far end a man with decaying skin and a lab coat standing hunched at a desk, along with 3 gelatinous blobs. We've asked if he had ordered the pizza, and the man snarled at us. He turned, snatched up a vial, and chucked it at us. We all dodged out of the way, and it splashed harmlessly on the floor, where it sizzled quietly. Before he could unleash another volley, Weeb dashed forward, took a flying leap, and with a melodramatic cry of "Sing, Sandy!" delivered a chop that carved straight through the thin, obviously diseased man. Stalwart heroes, that's us. The man fell to the floor in 2 pieces, and his companion blobs blobbed blobbily at us, with hatred in their blobby blobs. At least, we interpreted the wiggling as hatred, and so we attacked it preemptively. Or we tried to. Bard's superpowered fist bounced off of one, but he was more fortunate than Alwi, who struck one only to get his fist stuck, and then slowly be pulled inside the gelatinous spheroid. Tello had much more success with her flaming sword, and was able to free Alwi with a few swipes. Handy defeated one by pulling a bottle of Goo Gone from his bag and dousing the enemy spheroid with it. It worked as advertised, because reality is silly sometimes. Kitty stabbed the last one with his lightsaber, and we moved towards the one door on the far side of the room. Entering the next chamber, we found ourselves standing on a raised platform overlooking rows and rows of tanks that stretched into the distance farther than the eye could see. They were all filled with the bodies of young men suspended in some sort of fluid. And they all looked like Archimedes. Clones. We had suspected this, but it was nice to get confirmation. But the real question was, how many were there? On a nearby table, Handy found some notes regarding alchemical compounds and magical rituals that seemed to relate to how the ancient wizard had managed this. Nothing indicated where the zombies and horrible creatures had come from, however. Even when Always sent his mind back a day in time to watch events, on fast forward, of course, all he saw was a conveyor belt spitting out clones at a steady rate, although he did notice a few broken tubes in the background. When he pointed those out, we saw them too. The way the glass was broken, something had burst its way out. Apparently the first clones out had been awakened through some unexpected process. There was also a sophisticated electrical panel over on the wall that seemed to be monitoring, or maybe controlling, the status of, so it said, 2.5 billion clones. We decided not to push the release button and reassessed Archimedes' ranking on our threat scale. Moving quickly through the room and vowing not to think too hard about it later, we came to a staircase. We could hear moaning and banging coming from the top, so Tello entered her spirit form and scouted ahead. Upstairs, she saw a giant, fleshy mound in a vaguely humanoid shape, moaning and slamming its body against a massive metal door. Little jumpers capered about it. There was also another door closer to the stairwell, and when Tello poked her head inside, she found a guest bedroom with a laptop sitting open. A cursory investigation showed it belonged to Critical. There were also a number of books about spirit magic. When Tello informed us, Barb recalled that, in addition to his studies at the Celestial Chorus, Critical had taken up an under-the-table apprenticeship with Archimedes. Critical was a pretty private person, and only mentioned it the once, which is why we hadn't considered it a possibility. We had all honestly forgotten. Tello told us about the monsters upstairs, and we formed up in the stairwell to make a heroic charge. Tello let loose with a fireball while Handy tossed a grenade, which was followed by the charge of the bulked-out Weeb and Bard. They battered aside the crispy jumpers. All we raced in at super speed to finish them off, and the two fighters laid into the meat man. It fought back lustily, but the monster was no match for the magically enhanced muscle of our melee masters, who mutilated the meat man messily. Sandy the chainsword really helped, and carved through the monster in a matter of moments. Ollie tried to assist, storing up time to move in a blur of speed and motion, but as he did, every one of his attacks missed the creature entirely. Even in super slowed time, Ollie didn't have the greatest accuracy. As they wailed on it, Tello pulled a card from a deck in a hip holster, kind of like a player at a children's card game. This was a tarot card, though, the Ten of Swords. 10 swords planted themselves in the creature's back. The fight really didn't last long, and as the creature fell, it turned into a young facsimile of Archimedes. So did the jumpers, and when we looked out the window, we could see all the zombie and monster corpses changing. Weeb went to pound on the door to notify Archimedes of his rescue, but Bard figured that it hadn't worked for the monsters and stopped his friend. Then he rang the doorbell to the side of the door. Archimedes' face appeared in midair, demanding to know what we wanted. "Archimedes, it's us! The Iron Goldfish! We saved you! You're safe!" "What? Who? Go away, I'm busy." "We have pizza and weed." "Come in, my friends." And the door slid open. Inside, we found Critical sitting at a table with Archimedes, being berated by the older mage as he pored through scrolls. The older mage was shouting something about putting souls where they didn't belong. When we finally coaxed him to a window and he surveyed the damage, he said it was because Critical had screwed up and accidentally given one of the clones a soul, which had interacted badly with the alchemical mixture used to make it in the first place. It must have broken out of its tank, gone crazy, and started to mutate both itself and some of the brethren it freed. The other clones were obviously part of the realm's automated defenses. At least that's what he assumed, since the study room was soundproofed. So neither he nor Critical had no idea any of this was going on. When we asked if he wasn't rebelling, as the Hermetics feared, Archimedes laughed and said they accused him of going rogue every other week. We were somewhat reassured, but noted that that wasn't exactly a no. Still, defeating the meat man seemed to have solved the issue, and Archimedes checked to make sure his magical defenses were reined in. And we had found Critical, so we were pretty happy. We joined the ancient wizard in enjoying his pizza and herb, deciding the Hermetic Order could wait for the good news. Although we did let Kevin know we wouldn't need the nukes after all. He sounded a bit disappointed. Is the problem truly solved? Just how powerful is Archimedes? Will our heroes have to deal with this potential potent threat? Find out in the next Mage Storytime.